Hello there and welcome back to Liberty and Logos after what has been a sizable break. We are now back up and running, and I'm going to start this video by giving a few announcements. So you can expect each month to see one of the sort of traditional discussion type videos that we've been doing so far. One video where we have a guest and it's more like an interview. The other two videos that we'll be putting out each month, and it could be more, but we want to go for a baseline of two, are solo videos of the kind that I made before on coronavirus and I'm making now. As for why there's been this hiatus, I think that those of you who have been following us know that there were developments in my personal situation which made it impossible for me to properly record. After leaving Britain, I spent a few weeks making sure it was the right decision and playing things over in my mind, and then I went to Canada and sought asylum. So I'm now in Canada. I'm a refugee, and I spent the first 15 days in isolation in a refugee camp, and then I spent the next sort of 2 or 3 weeks in a refugee shelter in the city. Now I'm more or less a free person, and since that allows me to make these videos again. So I hope you enjoy this one. It's going to go into more detail about the coronavirus situation from the point of view of the government reaction.
Okay, ladies and gentlemen, so prepare yourself for death by PowerPoint. This is my short presentation on the reaction to the coronavirus situation. There's going to be things that I just don't mention in this because I'm assuming that you know them, like how full of shit the figures are, and how even if you take the figures and the narrative that the government's putting out at face value, their reaction is obviously overblown. I just want to give you some specific details and show you some background that you may not be aware of, and mention some theories that you might also not be aware of. Okay, so a minute ago I was telling you that I left the UK due to the Coronavirus Act, and I want to give you a bit more information about why that is. There's a longer explanation of this available on Peter Quinones' podcast, which I will link to in the description. But essentially, the Coronavirus Act that was passed on March 25th allows for arbitrary arrest without probable cause. So if police officers suspect, or say they suspect, that you may have been infected with coronavirus, they can just arrest you for no other reason. Okay, so they don't have to have a cause that you have a virus. You don't have to look sick or be displaying any symptoms. They just have to suspect you. So there's probable cause out the window. And the Act also allows for arbitrary and indefinite detention. Okay, they can hold you as long as they like. Okay, without charge. The United Nations, I'm not their biggest fan, but the fact of the matter is that if they're playing by the rules, if Britain's playing by the rules, the United Nations considers arbitrary and indefinite detention to be tantamount to torture. Their representative, Nils Melzer, the special rapporteur on torture, has described arbitrary detention in the UK as a murderous system being created before our very eyes. Okay. More worryingly for me specifically, because I have some issues with my mental health, is that this Coronavirus Act alters the law regarding the sectioning of patients who have mental health issues. Okay, so before the Act, you had to have the signature of 2 doctors plus a mental health caseworker, and one of the doctors must have had a personal history in dealing with you. But the Act removes this safeguard, and now the signature of only 1 doctor is required. They don't have to have any history with you. They don't even have to have met you. It can be done over the phone. So also before the Act, even if you were sectioned, you could refuse the medication that they were giving you. Now you can be forcibly drugged, and people are being forcibly drugged against their will. Okay, this is a pretty bad situation. So, some more worrying things that have been found out in this context. This is things I've discovered after leaving, which makes me feel more glad about that. There's a disability charity called Turning Point, and they found evidence of fraudulent do not resuscitate forms. Okay, so people are being sent to hospital with their forms. Neither themselves nor their families actually made them. They were filled out by who exactly, we don't know. The chief executive of this charity has described this as making an advanced decision not to administer CPR if a person's heart stops solely because they have a disability is not only illegal, it is an outrage. Close quote. So, on this basis, we see some worrying signs about the kind of culture, the medical culture that we're seeing developing now in the aftermath of this situation. We should also note that since the passing of this act, deaths of those who've been sectioned have doubled in just the last few months. Okay, that's another fact for you. That comes from the Health Service Journal, which is the internal publication for the NHS. The Royal College of Psychiatrists has warned that as a result of the measures introduced by the UK government, that there's going to be, and probably has already been, a tsunami of serious mental illness for people with no previous history. Okay, so living under these draconian laws makes people sick in and of itself. This kind of culture that I'm showing you some glimpses of, I think it's worth drawing a parallel with what happened in the Soviet Union. When people spoke out against things that the government were doing in Russia, very often these people were sectioned to shut them up. So it was a way of punishing them in a sort of to dissuade others from doing the same. Like, oh, maybe I shouldn't speak out because my neighbour got sent off to a mental hospital even though I knew there was nothing wrong with him. It is also a form of torture to break the people and make them fall in line with the totalitarian conditions that they're expected to live under. So I don't think it's a stretch at all to see how all of these provisions that I've just been describing combine not only to quell protests very effectively, but they can also just take people out of the equation altogether. Okay. There have been some dissident voices speaking out about this. Notably, a former Supreme Court judge has published a number of articles. Here's a quote from him. He says that this is without a doubt the greatest interference of personal liberty in our history, and we have to ask ourselves, what are the limits to the things that the state can legitimately do to people against their will in a liberal democracy? To say that there are no limits is the stuff of tyrants. Every despot who ever lived thought that he was coercing his subjects for their own good or that of society at large. I think that quote pretty much speaks for itself. I don't think that he's probably figured out that he's no longer living in a liberal democracy. Maybe he's a little bit too naive, because being a judge, he kind of has some kind of underlying faith in the system. But there we go, a fairly powerful, notable voice speaking out. A barrister called Francis Hoare has compiled a set of arguments which you can take a look at on the UK Human Rights blog, entitled Disproportionate Interference, the Coronavirus Regulations and the European Convention on Human Rights. In this, I think he very conclusively proves beyond all doubt that the Coronavirus Act and the accompanying health regulations are unlawful under those human rights laws, that they're disproportionate. What is being done is not at all warranted by the situation, and they're actually even ineffective, because a number of deaths are said to have been recorded from the virus, which is pretty much equal to many places where there weren't these kind of measures introduced. So basically, whatever you want to say, about these laws, they just haven't worked. I want to make a point now that this is not something that's just come out of the blue, and I feel like in the UK, this is something we've been building towards. I'm going to put in the description a list of liberties that have been lost in the UK since the year 2000 for you to check out, and you can see how these incrementally build up and sort of enable this current set of laws to go through as like the latest in a progression of steps. This list is an edited version of a very long list that was compiled by Ian Parker Joseph, who I think was then one of the leaders of the UK Libertarian Party. And this was done more than 10 years ago, so it's not fully up to date, but it gives you an inkling of how this is not something that's come out of the blue, but has been building up for many years. Okay. So what else have we got? Well, the elections in the UK have been postponed. Of course, they say it's for a year. Whether that turns out to be true, we don't know. But essentially, that idea of whether or not Britain is a liberal democracy, well, if the functional elements of representation in the civil society that are meant to be there, this is the equivalent of like county level government, city level government being postponed, you have to ask yourself, what does that mean for the concept of democracy? And there's another parallel that I want to draw here. Okay, so does this sound familiar? It looks like my red circle has appeared in the wrong place. Don't worry too much about that. But look at here. This is what was known as the Enabling Act in Nazi Germany, which was actually named the law to remedy the distress of the people and the Reich. Okay, Article 5 is the one I want to draw your attention to here. That it was introduced in 1933 and it was meant to expire 4 years later in 1937. Okay, so this idea that all of these measures in the UK are temporary and the elections are being cancelled for this year, but they'll be back next year. I think it's worth keeping an eye on this because we've seen this kind of thing happen before. Is the point I'm trying to make. What else sounds very fishy? Well, a number of police forces have openly said to citizens that they should call the police if people are repeating conspiracy theories. So the kind of things that I'm saying in this video and said in my last video, if my family were worried about this and thought it was kind of problematic, they should call the police, is what the authorities is asking them to do. And this article here from reclaimthenet.org quite correctly says that this idea sounds like it should come out of China, and not one of the so-called liberal democracies of the world. In America, I shall play you this clip in just a second. There's a number of issues, but first I want to show you a clip that you may not have seen.
What's up, Barry?
All right, man.
What do you know, Barry?
You can take out the mask, Doug. The case fatality rate's like 0.1 to 0.3 according to USC.
Is it really? That's reassuring.
USC.
Everybody here's been vaccinated anyway.
Okay, so what did you just hear? Well, you saw a Fox News correspondent having a conversation with an unnamed gentleman who was wearing a mask, and the correspondent says to him, "You can take the mask off." This is inside the press office room of the White House. You take the mask off because the mortality rate is 0.1 to 0.3. Okay, this is obviously in contradiction to what is going out across the media. It's very interesting that this was caught on a hot mic when people didn't realise they were being recorded and then publicised. But more eerie is the fact that the gentleman says, "Is it really? Well, that's reassuring. Everyone here has already been vaccinated anyway." That's not something that seems to fit with the official narrative. And the point I'm making by bringing this video up is that after it was published by Matt Couch of the DC Patriot, I never saw any reference to it ever again. Is that because Twitter and Facebook and Google were keeping it out? Or is it because the correspondent Matt Couch was warned, don't make too big a thing of this? Or is there some other sort of angle on this that I'm not even aware of. All I know is I saw this thing, thought it would be huge news, and then I never heard anything about it again. So if anyone's got any ideas on that, please feel free to chime in. There's also been literal fake news created in America whereby CBS were caught by Project Veritas creating this situation where there was a clinic where people were going to be tested, and they just basically constructed the line of people from actors. Okay, you can check this out if you want, but it's very well documented now that they were just caught testing the story. They tried to, even after that, to lie about it, but then, you know, their lies became too much for them and they basically had to admit it. So is mandatory vaccine still a conspiracy theory to many of you, or are you still thinking that this is something that could possibly be on the cards? Here's an article from a couple of weeks ago in Forbes magazine. The United States is prepping for COVID-19 mass vaccination with $110 million spent on needles and syringes. This is the associate editor for security in Forbes magazine who's putting this article across. Another one you should definitely check out. Another angle, I think, which is becoming less and less like conspiracy theory and more like fact all the time. So even the voices of reason are alarmed. Matt Walsh, fairly sort of middle of the road conservative writer, works for the Daily Wire, has actually, you know, written a number of articles now where he's saying, okay, this has gone too far. This is actually a police state, and people should do something and speak up about this. So, yes, since that particular article there was published on April 6th, things are sort of reopening back up in America. But how long will it stay like that? I hope I'm wrong, and things continue to open up and open up and open up and open up. But, you know, there's always this possibility of the so-called second wave and things being dialed back and, you know, what have you. So, you know, something to be watched for sure. Okay, so leaving the UK and the US behind now and looking at the bigger picture, what else have we got that's interesting? Well, obviously there was Gordon Brown, former Prime Minister of the UK, calling for a global government to tackle this situation. We also see some, you know, very predictable responses about who's going to be sort of targeted and marginalized and disenfranchised and silenced. Obviously, anti-vaxxers have been demonized for many years, but here we've got the New York Times, one of the leading sort of portals for the government voice, saying, well, you know, there's a lot of these activists forming up at the virus protests. Maybe this could harm the country's response. It's all fear mongering, and if you're not aware of, you know, the problems with the vaccine situation, I just think that you should do yourself a favor and actually go ahead and educate yourself, because even just a little bit of research, I think, will unsettle you enough to be, if not skeptical of vaccines altogether, at least supportive of the people who want to speak out against it. Okay. Now, finally, there are some lesser known theories that from some broadcasters who don't have the biggest audience, but they do have interesting ideas. So I wanted to draw your attention to this one, which has been developed by Jason Horsley, the writer, and his wife, and it's called Illuminations Never Come from the Crown: Carbon Credit, New Reserve Currency, and the Oligarchic Green Lockstep to a Post-COVID-19 World. Okay, so in this article, and there's a subsequent update to it as well, the Horsleys are putting across the idea that the COVID-19 fake pandemic could actually be part of a series of events designed to bring about massive changes to our world. And I encourage you very strongly to check out this article and the one that follows from it. Interesting quote there at the bottom from Henry Kissinger from recent times, quote, "The crisis effort, however vast and necessary, must not crowd out the urgent task of launching a parallel enterprise for the transition to the post-coronavirus order." It's very typical of the kind of thing that Kissinger and other globalist powermongers have said over the years about other similar crises, and it makes you wonder the degree to which these crises are engineered to bring about these massive changes. Okay, so there we are. I hope I've given you some pause for thought, and if you have any comments or ideas of your own in response, I would love to hear them. Thank you very much for listening.